I do have that Zoom meeting at 1:30. So.
Okay.
All right, here we go. Welcome back to the ZERT Coffee and Chaos podcast, the show where we talk about anything and everything to what it means. Nope, fuck that up. Welcome back to the ZERT Coffee and Chaos podcast, the show where we talk about anything and everything relating to what it means to be a survivalist and a prepared individual in today's society. I'm your host, Chris Bartigone, ZP002. Back with me, my co-host, Jamie Franks. Jamie, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Always is. Always good to have you, man. It's these shows are fun, man. I know that I've enjoyed, and we've talked about this before. I've talked about it with Paul before, and as you know, we record these and we pre-record them, and usually we will sprinkle in a hot topic if something pops up. And at the time of this recording, it's 2 days post the last debacle. I mean the debate, where they talked about a lot of things, and there was stuff about Aurora, Colorado, which we did a show about. And now it's so funny that now that's being talked about in different light, like it's not happening. And then the video that we did talk about and that we did put up on that show, it's not real, which I believe we talked about in our show. But anyway, and since then, obviously I've done a couple of shows with Paul. I've done a couple of shows with you. We had a special guest on the show, Vincent Vargas from old Article 15 days. I don't know if you remember that t-shirt company, but then he was on the show Mayans MC. He's former Ranger, and now just does and did stuff with the border. So it's always fun having new people on the show. I've got a couple other guests that are special guests that are coming. One's a ZERT member who is big in our comms group, and we've talked about comms. I think you and I have talked about comms in the past, and I've probably even talked about it with Paul, but admittedly, it's probably my weakest subject when it comes to this kind of stuff. And so it's going to be good to have somebody who they do the weekly check-ins. They do the, they try and connect with the ZERT net. So it's always fun to have other guests on, but I always love having you on too, Jamie. We talk about lots of good stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, for what that's worth, I would also say radio comms is probably my weakest link too. Like I've always said, like in the survival sphere, my weakest link is like knowing like what plants and stuff you can eat. I'm not very good at that. Yep. And then in the tactical sphere, comms. I mean, because in the military, and when I say this, I don't mean that I was a Navy SEAL or a Delta Force guy or whatever, but in the Navy, job specialties are broken down between being an operator and being a technician. An operator meaning somebody that dresses like a ninja and lowers themselves through ventilation ducts. No, an operator is somebody that operates a piece of equipment, and a technician is somebody who comes and fixes it. And I've always been an operator. I've never been a technician. So I've been handed a radio. I've been taught how to program the radio that was handed to me, and I know how to talk on it and stuff like that. But I'm in the civilian ham radio, and what is it, GMRS or whatever?
GMRS,
I don't. Yeah, I'm not the one on that. So that's definitely something I need to come up on myself. But yeah, I always like the wide array of topics that we cover on here, and sometimes we skew into things that weren't necessarily intended. But yeah,
it's funny. Even talking to you today, I was like, hey, this video that I'm about to put up, did we have another video that needs to go in there? And you're like, we've talked about so much on and off the show that I don't remember either. So it's funny, the video that because as you guys all know, so first of all, thank you all for taking some time and listening yet again to the ZERT Coffee and Chaos podcast. Obviously, as you know, it's on Spotify and Apple. And I would love it if you guys could do me a favor. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please do me a favor and rate the show. I love to hear that kind of feedback. I'd love to know what you like about it, what you would like to see more about it. But then also, as you guys are aware, we put this the video portion of it over on YouTube, and it usually follows after the show. And what's good about that is sometimes when we're talking about things here, we post a video or we post a picture of something that we're referring to. And that show that I was talking to you about today, we had that technical issue again. So it's always a challenge here. But today's show is a kind of a part two. When we put some of these out, we limit the show to a reasonable time, usually roughly about an hour. But there's often times where we have a lot more to say, and whether that's because we deep dive into some of the pieces of the subject that we're doing the show about, which is common, right? I think it's a common thing to where you just kind of go off on a tangent or talk about things a little bit more in depth than you planned on. But we always realize that at the end of the show, we could probably go on for another hour, which just makes it even better so we can put a part two out. So in the past, we've talked about shelter building, and we talked about kind of the different types of shelter and what you would need and kind of when it's important to build a shelter, but we didn't go too deep into the how to on some of that. And it may be a little bit challenging, right?
No, but so I don't even remember how long ago it was, but we started down this path where we were doing, we called it, I think, the survival series, where we were talking about primitive fire making and water treatment and filtration, all that stuff. And so shelter building, contrary to most people's understanding, in your 4 priorities of survival, shelter, water, fire, food, that is your 4 priorities in order. Shelter is actually the first one. A lot of people mistakenly or because they misunderstand, they think water is your most important, but historically, statistically, and everything I've been trained, shelter is actually your top priority. And so the last shelter building installment that we did as part of the survival series, I think we thought we were going to be able to cover everything, but we kind of we really just mainly talked about why shelter is that number 1 priority. Why is shelter more important than water? And then we talked about kind of the 5 W's, the when, the where, the why, but we never got into the nuts and bolts of the how. So
yeah. Now, and everyone might be asking, well, how are you going to get into that? Sure, you're right. I mean, without getting out into the wilderness to show you how to build them, obviously it's going to be a little bit more of a challenge. But this show is never I don't think we've ever done a how-to show, and I don't think that we ever will do a how-to show, because we can lay out the idea, and then it's up to you to go and figure out how to do it on your own. So we're going to talk about the how-to on building some of the shelters that we discussed in the previous episode. Some are probably going to be easier to do than others based on where you are and your surroundings and what you have with you. And I'm sure that's going to be obviously very situation and person dependent. So,
yeah. And this is going way back when we first, what podcast episode is this, by the way? Do you even know?
So what I can tell you is that yesterday, or what's today? Today's Thursday. So today's show was episode number 80. So this will be post.
So I mean, if we're doing an episode weekly, I mean that's 80 weeks. So we're coming up on having done this for approximately a year and a half. But this is one of the things I talked about way back in the earlier days. Is my goal with being on this podcast is not to give you the answer to everything. I hope people that listen to this podcast and watch this podcast, I hope they leave every episode with a couple of notes and a couple of things to go and look up. And this is going to be a classic episode or classic example of that, because I'm going to reference things that are very easily Googleable. And so, when I say Plow Point shelter, you can go and look up Plow Point shelter, and then you'll have a visual reference of it. But yeah, I mean, this is going to kind of be a how-to.
Right.
But yeah, it's not going to be step 1, do this, step 2, do that. And because that's with shelter building, most of it, the biggest part of it really is improvising anyway. And
Right.
and it's based on your location and your environment and your,
Now,
weather.
sure, but what I will say is, we're going to list out those shelters. So, what was the shelter that you just mentioned?
Oh, the one I just mentioned was a Plow Point shelter, but
Okay. So
that's a cool name.
if you want to learn how to build a Plow Point shelter or any of the shelters we talk about, I mean, you just start with that, right? Okay, so that's what I want to start with. What am I going to need? Basic, right? I don't think you're going to bring out your carpentry kit and your, your hammer and your saw. I mean, figure out what you need at the most and then figure out how to back that down a little bit and you go build one of these shelters. Again, it doesn't have to be a 3-floor with windows and doors and shutters type situation. Understand what you're building here. So
yeah, well, and that goes back to something I've talked about a lot actually is like on my personal YouTube channel, one of my most popular videos was me. I mean, it's kind of a long video because I go into everything. But I pull out what I call my get home pack in my car, and I go through like each individual item and why I chose that item for the kit. But the overarching kind of theme of the whole thing is every single thing in not just my survival kit, but every single thing in one's survival kit should have multiple uses. You should not, in my opinion, and maybe with very few specific examples, I would say a good rule of thumb is that nothing in your survival kit should be single use. That like every single thing that you choose for your survival kit should have multiple uses. I can use this thing for this. I can use it for that. I can use it for that. And so shelter building is kind of the same thing. Is like that should definitely be part of every survival kit is items that can be used to build a shelter. And like just another quick example. That maybe somebody hasn't thought of, but like I took just a small little Ziploc bag. I don't know, like if you ordered a set of screws online, they would come in a little plastic Ziploc bag, maybe a 3x5 little Ziploc bag or whatever when they get shipped to you. But a little Ziploc bag like that, and just fill it with like drywall screws, because drywall screws can be used if you're out on survival or trying to get home and you find an abandoned building or an abandoned house. You can take your Gerber multi-tool and drywall screws, and like if I'm going to sleep in this room for the night, I can use those screws to like as like a door lock to keep myself safe in the room. And if I'm building a survival shelter, that's a really great tool to be able to screw something into a tree, for example, and they're removable. So when you're done using them, you can just screw them back out and take them with you and all that stuff. But beyond that, beyond your survival kit, it does, especially when it comes to shelter building, you do have to understand the difference in survival, at the way I reference survival, and survival like on the TV show Alone. All the survival training that I have and most of the survival knowledge that I have and experience, like when we've done like training exercises and stuff that are around survival and evading and stuff like that, survival is ultimately working towards self-rescue. So you mentioned something about building a 3-story log cabin. Well, that might be what they do on the show Alone, but in the show Alone, their goal is to stay there. When I am on what I consider survival, my goal is to get out. My goal is to move on. My goal is to, again, what we refer to as self-rescue.
Yes.
So there is the difference between survival and sustainment. My definition of survival means that I'm trying to get out of a situation, get to a better situation, get to a better place, get rescued, whatever. In a situation like Alone, they are deliberately trying to sustain. They are deliberately trying to stay in one place for as long as possible. And in my opinion, in survival, you, again, with very few examples, like with a plane crash, you would kind of want to stay near the wreckage because that's where they're going to come look for you. Which we've done we did a specific
We did a
episode
show
on that as well.
Yep. So what would you say is the most common type of shelter to, well, let's see. Should we base it off of commonality or ease?
I would say both, because I would say a good goal for a person building a survival shelter, meaning I need a place to get out of the elements. I need a place to get dry. I need a place to stay warm. I need a place to be in shade, whatever like that. I would say a good rule of thumb to start with, understanding that you can always improve upon it later, but it's cold. It's either extremely cold or it's raining and I'm going to get hypothermia, or I'm in 110-degree heat and I need to get out of that 110-degree heat, or whatever the case may be. I would say when you're building your survival shelter, I would say a good goal is to be able to erect some sort of usable, adequate shelter in about 15 minutes.
Right.
And again, when you're in survival, you need to conserve energy. You need to conserve calories. You need to try not to sweat out whatever hydration you have in you. So with all of that in mind, the most basic, and there's a little bit of a historical context here too, the most basic and fastest and typically most effective type of shelter would just be a simple lean-to shelter.
Right.
And the historical context is like back in World War I and even up through World War II, your basic Marine infantrymen and Army infantrymen, they were like, that was part of your standard like loadout. Like, things have evolved today where my standard individual combat equipment is, a plate carrier and a chest rig and all that. But back in World War I, World War II, every infantryman, soldier, and Marine was actually issued a tent half as part of their gear. And you can see it like in old World War II movies, like the Sands of Iwo Jima, stuff like that.
Right.
Each Marine has like a kind of a small backpack, and then it has like this canvas, looks like a rolled up piece of canvas or something that kind of goes up and over the backpack.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, G.I. Joe men used to come with it too.
Right.
But that was your tent half, and that was if you were on your own, you could use your tent half to make a lean-to, and if you were with a buddy, you could both put your tent halves together and have a pup tent.
Right.
So, but to build a lean-to, it like, number one, in a lot of environments, like I said, it's very effective, it's very fast, and you don't need a lot of stuff. So like in that survival kit, in anybody's survival kit, you should have it's called like the standard version. The standardized version is the 5 C's of survival, and that's something. Right. It's cutting, combustion, cover, container, and cordage, right? And then I've seen these other blowhards on the internet that have the 25 C's of survival, right, and one of them is cover yourself with insect repellent and come to a place where you can be rescued. Like, so they're just making stuff up, but you need a cutting tool, a combustion tool, meaning something to start a fire with, a cover, meaning a tarp or a blanket or whatever. I'll talk about that in a second. A container, so like using the TV show Alone, because it's very popular right now. Like they all bring a pot with them. That's one of the things that they always bring, because that's a very useful thing. So a container, something like that. And then cordage is going to be your most useful thing ever that you can actually have in a survival kit. But look, if you don't have cordage in your survival kit, you can use things like your bootlaces. And like if you're wearing a hoodie or a jacket that has a drawstring, you can, pull the drawstring out and have cordage that way. But all you need is cordage. And then like you could, unless you're a really experienced expert, improvising things is very difficult. It's one of those things that a lot of people think they can do. Like people think they can go rip vines off of a tree and make cordage. But it's much more difficult than that, unless you're an expert that's very well practiced. Finding natural things around you to make a waterproof covering. Because you might think, because I saw this on Discovery Channel, I can just lean some sticks. I can put up my 550 cord and then just lean some sticks and then get some pine boughs and overlap them, and it'll be waterproof. Like, again, like improvising something that that sheds water is actually quite difficult.
Yeah.
And the people that do it on TV that make it look easy, number one, it's TV, so it may not actually be legit. And also,
Correct.
if you see somebody on TV doing it and they make it look easy, they're probably an expert. So cover can be something like I like a rolled up heavy duty trash bag, because a very tightly rolled up trash bag, you can open it and it's actually like pretty big the way it comes.
Yeah, like one of those 55 gallon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I have written down here is a 55
Yeah.
gallon heavy duty trash bag. You can split it and make it twice as big as it is as a bag. It's waterproof. It's shade. You can, in the other episode we talked about how you can use a piece of plastic to make water. So anyway, lean-to, very fast, very effective, and really all you need is some type of cordage and something to use as a covering. So a tarp or a trash bag, or I don't know, like, I guess if you had a jacket or something that was big enough, you could use that, but then you're having to take the jacket off your body. But anyway,
Right.
you need something. But lean-to, very, very simple and easy to make. You just string a piece of cordage between two points, two trees, two rocks, two whatever, and then you would need to kind of anchor down the bottom part, and then you lean it over out of like a 45-degree angle and drape it over the cordage. And now you got a lean-to, and then you can do like a modified lean-to, like I just said, that has the cover going up, and then it kind of laps over.
Yeah.
So now it's shedding water from two directions, but that's going to be your easiest, quickest shelter, and that's what they trained in the military way back.
Now, obviously, with that lean-to, should you want to practice with some of those items that Jamie just listed out, by all means, do that. Is there a primitive version of this? Should you not have the kit? Well, yeah, I think there is, and it's kind of the same thing that you just said. You could probably, with building up your base knowledge of skills, you could probably fashion some kind of cordage from natural materials out there. Could you find downed branches or trees that give you the length that you need and the width that you need? You probably could. Are there some kind of large branches with pine on them that you could use instead of the garbage bag? Well, sure, there are. And you can research all of that, and you can pull up pictures of probably very primitive lean-tos that provide you some form of shelter. Will it stop the rain, the snow? No. Does it make sense to, carry all of those things in a car, in a bag with you? Yeah, it does. But we talk about a survival situation, and there's going to be times when you don't have that, or I'm sorry, not there's going to be times you may run into a situation where you're in a forced survival situation, and you do not have those tools, have the knowledge to, or have done the research to have the knowledge to build it without the materials is crucial. So
yeah, and we did that specific episode on the plane crash, which
correct,
I think was very interesting. It was a case study on a true event that had happened, where these small children survived in the wilderness for a long period of time after a plane crash. But one of the points we made about the plane crash was that's a perfect example of a situation where your quote unquote lack of preparedness isn't because you're not prepared, but when, at least in the United States, when you get on board an airplane, they basically take everything from you that would be useful in a survival situation. You're not allowed to have a cigarette lighter. You're not allowed to have matches. You're not allowed to have a blade. You're not, so yeah, like that, that's what Chris means when he's talking about like a forced survival situation where you don't know anything. And like, this is kind of off topic, but it relates. One of my good friends just on Instagram yesterday, he said, he did this little video on Instagram. He was having a problem with his diesel engine on his Ford truck, and he said the dealership was gonna charge him $5,000 to do it, and they said they were gonna need to keep his truck for like 3 to 4 weeks. He went and got the parts and did it himself. It cost him $1,000 to get the parts, and it took him 1 day to do it himself. And one of the points he made in the video, or he made a second video afterwards, because he was like, "Hey guys, I'm getting a lot of messages, and one of the questions I keep getting was, how did I know how to do this repair?" And his answer is that he didn't. He's never done this before. He's never actually torn into that part of the engine before. But because he's generally good at mechanical things, he was able to figure it out and do it. And that's what we're talking about here, is like, you don't need a black belt in shelter making. You need to have a little bit of experience and a little bit of practice, and just knowing how to be a logical, mechanical kind of problem solver, and shelter building, is.
And like we said, the lean-to is probably the most common and probably the easiest to put together. There are some safety things when it comes to, obviously, the lean-to, because if you don't have that cordage and you're attaching that top pole, that brace pole, you want to make sure that that's safe so it doesn't come crashing down. Obviously, there's going to be some kind of fire safety with that. With probably a good portion of these, you're using materials that can catch on fire to build the shelter that you're going to build a fire inside of. So that always needs to be in the back of your head. It's quick. It provides some level of protection, and it's very versatile, but as far as space and insulation, that's where you're going to be a little bit lacking. That being said, the goal is not to move in and figure out how to build an addition on it. The goal is to just get yourself out of the elements and figure out your next plan as far as rescue, unless you are wanting to build one of these out in the woods as your own man cave, and then figure out a way to make it a little bit more secure.
There's a channel, I was about to say a video on YouTube, but I actually think it's a whole channel, that this guy built this badass cabin in his backyard out of pallets, and the channel is called The Pallet Cabin. But like, kind of going into what we're talking about, like, this guy, it's amazing. Like, now, because it's several years on, and now it looks like a house that somebody built, but he made the whole thing out of pallets, and just like pallets that he got for free. And like, his ingenuity, like, he's basically built like the most badass man cave you could ever imagine, and built it all out of pallets he got for free. But we skipped over one of the key thing in shelter building, and I'm making the finger quotes right here. If you're in an area that offer, and I think that most environments in the United States, at least, would offer some brand of this. But obviously, the easiest thing to do for a shelter is if you can find, and Chris hit on it a second ago, finding something that's natural, like finding a tree that fell over onto another tree and that you can just get under, or if you can find a rocky outcropping or something that you can just get under, or a little cave that you can get into, or something like that, something that occurred naturally that you can use as a temporary shelter. It's just, you want to make sure there's nothing in there sharing it with you that can harm you. And that was one of the things we dug into in the last shelter building episode. I'll quickly hit it now. Like, when you're selecting your site for your shelter, be it a survival shelter or like a kind of a longer term shelter or a natural shelter or whatever, you want to make sure it's the 4 W's of site selection. You want to make sure you take into consideration the wind. You want to get out of the wind. You want to have, if you can, make it so your 4 considerations: wind, water, wood, and widowmakers. So wind, you want to try to be out of the wind, protected from the wind. Water, it's good if your shelter location provides convenient access to water, but also, like, you don't want to build your shelter in an environment where water becomes a problem, meaning that you build a shelter in a place where there could be a flash flood, or on the bank of a river that could rise and flood your shelter, something like that. Wood, if you're going to build a fire, access to wood and how far you have to go to get that wood and carry it is a consideration. And then widowmakers is kind of what I just alluded to, which made me think of this, is you don't want to build your shelter where something's going to fall on you in the middle of the night, or that, like, a flash flood would be another example of a widowmaker. Or like where a tree is going to fall on you, or you're going to crawl into this natural shelter and there's a rattlesnake in there. So that's your 4 W's of site selection, and we go if you want to listen back to the part 1 of shelter building, we go into those, I think, a little bit more in
Yeah.
depth. But yeah, natural shelter is definitely a thing. That one, if you can find a decent natural shelter, you can hop in there with no prep or not having to do any improvements on it, or maybe like very little. Like if you're a fan of The Office, like I am, Michael Scott builds he finds a little natural shelter and uses duct tape in his suit jacket to make a little improvised shelter. And it's actually, I mean, Michael Scott's kind of an idiot, but it's actually not too terrible. But yeah, the next one that I was going to say is a plow point shelter.
Yep.
And the plow point shelter is, so it's almost like a lean-to and almost like an A-frame, meaning like a pup tent, except it's closed on one end. So if you picture like an old bottom plow that a farmer pulls behind the tractor, it's shaped like this.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly what you're doing. You need an opening in the front, and kind of, again, you could use your cordage for this as like a spine to go back at a 45-degree angle. And instead of it being a lean-to, it's closed on 3 sides, open in the front. And when it's very simple, and very effective. Won't take you a lot to build, and offers a little bit more protection and cover and everything than a lean-to.
And with that, obviously, are you talking about building it at like a standing level at the front, and then it kind of tapers down towards the rear?
That's all good. I mean, you could do that, but no,
Yeah.
The ones I've seen would not be that big, because it's limited by how much material you have. So again, using the example of, if I made a little kit that had cutting, combustion, cover, cordage,
Right.
and a container, which, by the way, you could hit all 5 of those wickets in a very small kit. But using my example, where I said a 55-gallon trash bag would be almost like the perfect thing to put in a little survival kit. A 55-gallon trash bag is not going to be big enough to make a standing room thing. But
No.
if you had enough material, you certainly could.
Yeah. So it's almost like just something that you can lay in feet towards the drop in the shelter, and your head at the end. So you just kind of climb in and bed down. Okay.
And so, yeah, and people, like, if anybody's familiar, like, you can buy these things. It's called a bivy sack, BIVVY. Like, that's kind of like a plow point shelter, but it's like a bivy that you're making yourself out of stuff that you have. Yeah.
And you can do with that plow or bivy or whatever you decide. I mean, you can add a little bit of insulation with that, and you can, obviously you can grab your leaves, you can grab whatever's around you. But like we've talked about, we've referenced already a couple of times, you're not looking to be permanent here. So, if it's 75 degrees out, don't worry about insulating for heat. Just make sure that you've got some form of shelter.
Yeah, and I was gonna hit on this later, but you just alluded to it. In survival, the way I think of it, I think of a scenario where I'm gonna try to be moving, trying to be getting out, trying to do, like what I said, called a self-rescue, to get myself out of some place or some situation. But if you are in a situation where the best idea and the best plan is to stay put, improving your shelter is something that you should do daily. Like, you shouldn't just put up a lean-to and call it good. You should go and gather materials and find a way to elevate yourself off the ground. That's, and improve that insulation to keep you warmer, and improve that the water resistance and all those things. Because I think we talked about this before too, like constant shelter improvements. If you're in a situation where you would want to be doing that, that's something that keeps you busy and keeps your mind occupied, and it's something that has measurable progress, and all those things that are good for your mental strength if you're in a survival situation. So
Agreed.
Maybe in some situations, improving your shelter wouldn't be ideal, because the better idea would be to continue to move along. But there are several examples of times when staying put is a better idea if you think somebody's going to be coming to look for you. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay. what's next on your list?
So we're kind of going in a progression. Like obviously, natural is the best. Something that you found that you can just climb into that existed in nature. A lean-to is going to be the quickest, typically easiest thing to do. The plow point is kind of a modification on a lean-to, and then obviously like everybody would be familiar with an A-frame. An A-frame is probably the strongest of these when you're talking about either snowfall. Because I mean, I have a really good expensive tent that's it's a 4-season tent, and it's by it's mine is Marmot is the brand. It's really good. I've been really happy with it. I've camped in it in all kinds of conditions, like a couple of pretty extreme conditions. Snow is heavy. If you're in an environment where you're getting snowed on,
Right.
even my badass Marmot 4-season expensive Gucci tent, I was camping one time. It isn't here in Southern California, but it was up at elevation,
Okay.
and we started getting snowed on. And I mean, I was having to get out of the tent about once an hour to get all the snow off of it, because snow is actually incredibly heavy when it starts to accumulate on a tent. So an A-frame is good when strength is a consideration, because an A-frame is going to be stronger than that plow point. It's going to be stronger and more adequate than that lean-to. And yeah, like if you just think in your mind, just like what a regular like Boy Scout pup tent looks like, it looks like a triangle and just goes back. Still pretty easy to build. You do need the right materials like the rest of them. But the A-frame is going to be it's going to be the strongest off the bat, just by virtue of the shape that it is. And I think it's going to also be the easiest to improve upon if you decide to make improvements, or if you need to beef it up. So yeah,
the A-frame, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the additional, or I mean, maybe the A-frame's older and more wiser and better looking cousin would be the kind of a rounder version of that, or almost like a TP style.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where, but again, it just comes down to, and I know we sit here and we keep coming back to it. If you're going out to build a shelter that you want to stay in for a week because you want to test your survival skills, then build something that provides you a little bit of space and a little bit of room and a little bit of things to, like you just said, Jamie, to improve on each day. But if it's a survival thing and you're just waiting to get rescued, then build what you need. Not what you want.
And TP style is a great structure, and but if depending on what type of survival we're talking about, TP requires a lot of materials. The materials that are needed are big, because you need kind of like big logs or big poles to make it. So are you going to be able to like break that down and carry it with you and move it to another location, or so that's a great shelter, and that's why the Native Americans used it. But it takes a lot of materials, and it takes a lot of big materials that are not easily moved, especially if you're on the move, and if you're on the move by yourself. But all of these are considerations. But like always, can I build a fire without a cigarette lighter? Yeah, probably. Yep. But if you give me the option, I'm going to take the cigarette lighter. So, having a little survival kit is a great idea. Adding those really easy basic materials for shelter building into your survival kit it is going to be a good idea, because like I said, trying to improvise these things is not ideal, really. Most of these things are a lot more difficult than people think they are. This is kind of in line with people that think they can use their belt as a tourniquet because they saw it in a movie. That's not really, it really isn't doable, and unless I don't know, is there a belt out there that's specifically made to be a tourniquet? But or if you have a small enough waist and you actually are wearing a tourniquet as a belt. But other than that, using your belt as a tourniquet is really not practical, and it's not really doable. It's not really realistic. And thinking that you're going to be able to improvise cordage, and that you're going to improvise a waterproof like roof on a tent, or something like that, it's really not realistic unless you have a lot of training and experience. And the other thing is stakes. Uh,
Uh,
People
yeah.
think that like doing tent stakes or something is easy. You're like, oh, I'm going to take my Swiss Army knife and carve out a stick and drive it into the ground. And I'm telling you, as somebody with a little bit of experience in that, like
Right.
stakes are not easy. Um,
Right.
so that's why, like in your little kit, like all of these things can be they're very small and light. They don't really add much uh, in the way of bulk to your survival kit, but they do add a lot in the way of substance. And so, like I said, like instead of tent stakes, you could use drywall screws. You could like just put 10 drywall screws in your little survival kit, and that can be your stakes, because instead of staking into the ground, you could stake to the bottom of a tree or something like that.
Right. Yep.
Um, a 60-gallon heavy duty trash bag. Like when I say heavy duty, I mean like the thicker gauge plastic, like you would use to like in the fall when you're gathering up leaves and stuff in your yard, like the bigger, heavier duty trash can. I'm not talking about like the hefty Force Flex bags,
Right.
but like
Right.
I'm actually talking about the ones that are the heavier gauge plastic.
Yeah.
You can fold them and roll them up, and they when folded up and rolled up takes up less space than like a deck of cards.
Yeah.
Um,
Now, now, just to kind of go back to that,
okay.
Just the kit, right? So if we're talking about anybody out there that wants to go and build and practice some of these shelters, if you put together your shelter building kit and you keep that in your vehicle, and in that kit you have a tarp, you can build multiple different types of shelters with just the tarp without adding anything else. Sure, you can add the trees to it and use the tarp as um insulation or your roof, if you will, but you could literally build, like you just said, like the bivy, which would be that same plow shelter with just the tarp,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Yep.
throw stuff on top of it. So I think it's crucial, if you want to practice some of these, to get a tarp and try that. Try setting up a lean-to with just the tarp. Try setting up an A-frame with just the tarp and some cordage. But it's like you can accomplish that. Now, again, you're still going to have that whole safety situation with fire and whatnot. And you got to be careful of that. But I mean, there are instances out there, or there's probably pictures out there where people have used the tarp to make a hammock, tarp and cordage to make a tarp hammock. I don't know how useful it'll be. I mean, if you're 135, 140 pounds, you might be able to get away with that. But if you're on the, more robust side like myself, I'm not going to test that one out. But, at the end of the day, you can do a lot with just the tarp.
Yeah,
So just wanted
100%.
to kind of throw that in there.
So, but yeah. That's a great point. Like, if you're like, having a tarp in your vehicle or something might be cheap insurance, um, but actually having a tarp, even when you fold it up to its smallest, tightest, most rolled up, smallest thing, a tarp is still going to be
Very
pretty
big.
big.
Yep.
So yeah, so if you have that capability, that's a good point. I wasn't crapping on the idea of
Yeah.
having a tarp. It's
No,
just
no.
not the most ideal thing if you're putting a kit together. But things like 550 cord and a trash bag and
Right.
drywall screws, those are things that are very small, don't take up a lot of space, and can be very effective in a shelter building situation. But you just like made me think of another form of improvising.
That's what I'm here for.
The stupid example I gave a minute ago was trying to make a tent stake by carving a stake out of your Swiss Army knife and a stick you found on the ground. But thinking about the things that you have with you, like if you were out hiking somewhere and got stuck. Actually, 2 years. Oh shoot, that might have been 3 years ago now. When I was up in Glacier National Park, while I was there, they were discouraging people from going out, but they did make everybody aware that there was a lost hiker, because
Yeah.
he went out on this hike, and this storm moved in where the visibility like literally like fell to like zero visibility. Um, and so they were like, be on the lookout for this guy. Like, we don't encourage people to go out and look for him, because then you might get lost too. But in that guy's situation, instead of using tree limbs and stuff for tent poles, if you've got hiking poles, that's perfect for shelter building. Couple your hiking poles with,
Yeah.
if you had an additional rain jacket or something. Like you could make a improvised little shelter with that, or like I said
Yep.
earlier, pants or jackets or hoodies or whatever that have drawstrings in them. You could pull that out. If your bootlaces, you can take your bootlaces out, use them as cordage, and then put them back in your boots the next day when you go to move on. And something you talked about with me on the phone the other day, something that has 10 billion improvised usages, not the least of which could be for shelter building, is, do you know what I'm talking about?
Like you just said earlier, we've talked about so much on and off the phone.
It
Oh no!
rhymes with luck lape.
Oh yeah, good old duct tape.
Good
Oh
old
yeah,
duct tape.
good old duct tape. You can't beat that.
Yeah,
We solved a leaky boat problem with duct tape.
So, and again, a roll of duct tape is pretty big and pretty heavy. But one of the things that I was taught in the military that I've done, I'll take like a Q-tip or like a, I was about to say toothpick. A toothpick's not long enough, but like a shish kebab skewer or something like that, something rigid, and I'll just wrap duct tape around it. So I'll end up with a quote unquote roll of duct tape that's about the size of, I don't know, like smaller than a salt shaker. But you can reduce a roll of duct tape instead of it being on the big circular roll. You can like take a little chopstick or a matchstick or whatever and just kind of roll it like this and make it, and you can carry duct tape like that in a kit instead of having to carry the big fat roll. But duct tape can be used for everything.
Yeah, let me jump in there. And I learned this a while back. You can remove that center roll of duct tape. Like you can, I've seen it where, and if you go to Amazon, you can actually buy flattened duct tape. So the whole thing is you remove that cardboard roll and then you can flatten it up. And so it's not a big round thing. It's just a little bit flat. You may do that when you get to the bottom or the end of a roll and you want to, replace it with a new one. You take that out, you cinch that up, and it goes in your pack. Like I said, I have it in every one of the bags that I have, whether it's a get home bag, a 72-hour bag, a medical bag, there is duct tape in that bag.
Yeah. And like, I mean, we could probably do an entire episode on the uses, the survival uses of duct tape. But yeah, I mean, duct tape can be used for medical. It can be used for shelter building. It can be used to repair things. That's what it's for. But repair things you may not think of. But yeah, like duct tape is a great thing to have. I guess the more you have, the better. But there are a lot of creative ways where you can carry a good usable amount of duct tape without having to carry the big, fat, heavy roll of duct tape and trying to find room for that in your bag. Yeah.
Right.
And then like, if you're on an island where like FedEx boxes are washing up, you can use VHS tape to like make cordage and ice skate to make an axe.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's one of the things that, I think you get that skill training when you work for FedEx, only when you work for FedEx, because somehow you can use an ice skate to remove a tooth.
Yeah.
And
that's the advanced class.
That is the advanced class. Everyone knows what we're talking about there. Wilson. So as far as a couple other, and we've really discussed a few different ones, but like it's just so funny, these shows, they just start rolling and then you don't realize, you're like, wow, that's the end of the show. The lean-to is probably the most common, like we said. Whether you have a tarp, whether you don't have a tarp, it is short-sighted and only kind of one-sided, so you don't really get the full scope of the A-frame or whatnot. But where does a snow shelter sit on your list? And obviously, if you live in Southern California, you're not thinking about snow shelters, but Alaska and whatnot, you may be thinking more.
You're talking about like digging a shelter into the snow. Is that?
Yeah. Like you and I have also, we've watched the Outdoor Boys channel.
Outdoor Boys, I was watching it yesterday.
Yep. And that guy is famous for building shelters in the snow. and he puts in a lot of work. Like you said, snow is heavy.
I think from what I have seen, so and I guess I guess that's a great question, because this is an opportunity to make a great point. Um, I've seen a lot of people do it effectively. Like there's a couple of videos, the Outdoor Boys YouTube channel, that like where the whole video is just him doing that. He has lots of experience. He knows what to look for in terms
Very
of
true.
what the like how dry the snow is, or how wet the snow is, or how packed it is, or if there's a frozen layer on top, and if you can kind of tell it's on a hillside, then it's good. And
Right.
he lives in an area where there was one of the episodes where he was in the snow, where he like dug down into the snow a little bit, and
Yep.
he hit the top of a tree, which
Oh
meant
yeah.
there's an entire tree like that,
Yeah.
underneath. He's basically walking on top of the trees. So he talked about like that could make problems, because you could dig down and there could be like a pocket that you
Yep.
could fall into. So, my very first year in the Navy, when I first joined the Navy 27 and whatever years ago, my first year in the Navy was spent in Maine, and I was only 17 years old. So I did not make the fullest, best use of my time in the frozen tundra of Maine. Like
Okay.
I was stationed up in northern Maine, at a naval air station that's not there anymore. It closed down kind of
Wow.
like at the end of the Clinton administration. That was a big thing. If anybody else remembers that time, they were closing lots of military bases.
Okay.
So the joke in that area of Maine where I lived is that that area of Maine only had 2 seasons. It had winter and the 4th of July. But
Right.
that probably would have been a great time and a great place for me to learn some winter survival skills. But I was 17 years old. I was brand new in the Navy, and that's not how I spent my time. Other than that, I've never really lived long term, and I've never had any reason to have formal training in the Navy, because all of my deployments have been either to South America or Afghanistan, or
Right.
the Western Pacific, like Indonesia and places like that, places where it ain't snowing.
Right.
So the Navy has never really had any reason to give me winter survival training. So
Yeah.
all that being said, I think a snow shelter is great if you actually know what you're doing. But even
Yeah.
like a person like me that has a fair amount of general survival knowledge and training and experience, I don't know that I would try to build a snow shelter unless I was in some sort of situation where that seemed to be my only option. Because not knowing what you're doing, I could build a little snow shelter and get in it, and then it collapse on me, and I die from that instead of the whatever survival situation I was in.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think it's
It,
a great idea, and it's a
yeah.
great technique, and it's a great option. But that seems to me something that you would have to have very specific training and experience in, and I don't.
Right. Right. And that's one of the things that I want to obviously point out, because if you watch this channel, and I recommend everybody does go over and watch the Outdoor Boys channel on YouTube, and you'll see some amazing stuff. This guy goes out with sometimes very, very little and does a lot. But when he builds these shelters, he's doing it for hours, and he's using tools, and he's cutting out big chunks of snow or frozen snow, so it's kind of solid, and creating an igloo. I mean, and then he shapes it. So it's pretty interesting to watch. It is not something that an inexperienced person should try, because he does use a pole to measure down, and he usually measures, I think, 9 to 12 feet down, and then digs down and digs the shelter underneath that. So should that collapse, you're going to have a bad day. So yeah, not something that I would recommend, but it is definitely something I would love to learn how to do.
Yeah, I love watching. We're not affiliated with that
No.
guy. I've never met him, don't know him, never communicated with him at all. I love watching his YouTube channel. I would love to go. The one I was just watching yesterday, I was like, man, I would love to be out there with him. But like he makes me feel completely inadequate, because like his camp cooking skills are insane. His shelter
Dude.
building skills,
Yeah.
and it's the thing we talk about over and over and over and over and over. But with watching him in this YouTube channel, it's just so obvious. Like he actually knows what he's doing. He has his little techniques down. He has his little routine down. Like, he's not out there faking it when he builds the shelter, and he does it so quickly, and he, like, starting a fire is like nothing for him. And it's very plain to see that he has done these things a million times before.
And I don't know if we've ever talked about it, but one of the things that got me hooked on his channel was it was like a 3 or 4 part clip that I saw on TikTok. It's where I found that guy, and then I went and found the video. And when he starts the video, it's also what got me on the wool blanket push. When he started that video, he had his wool blanket, he had it laid out, he had a saw, a pot with like probably like a plastic bag with some dough in it, a piece of meat, a knife, and I think that was it. And he rolls up the wool blanket, like folds it and rolls it, takes a piece of cordage, ties it on both ends, and throws it on his shoulder like a backpack or a back roll, whatever. He walks out into Alaska. He didn't even have snowshoes on for this one. I don't think he did, but he walks out into this. And so basically he dug out an area large enough, and he just went and started chopping down trees, cutting down trees. And he threw all of these, and they're like dead pine trees. So there's no pine needles on them. They're dry, and it was snowing. So he had to use the wool blanket as a cover to use his ferro rod. That's the other thing. He had a ferro rod, and boom, starts a fire. Now he uses the fire to clear the area where he's going to camp for the night. But mind you, he didn't build a shelter. Like, this dude slept in Alaska with a fire
in the dead of winter.
In the dead of winter with a wool blanket. He was obviously fully dressed, but he cut down trees and he used the logs as a bed. He laid his wool blanket down. He put the bed over the hot coals. And again, why it was a wool blanket, because you don't have to worry about it catching on fire. But this guy is hardcore. This is the guy that I would love to learn how to build shelters with.
Well, so the only thing that you just said, this guy's hardcore. He's not tactical. He's not like a big tough guy. He's not like some big burly bearded bro veteran. Like, he's right. He seems to be the nicest, most unassuming, like gentle, like family man guy ever. Like, he's tall and kind of skinny, wears glasses. He's like not imposing at all.
I mean, listen, man, I'm just gonna say it.
Survival expert.
Yeah, like if you look at him, you're like, holy dork. Like, that's what he looks like. And the funny thing is like, he started out doing missionary work, and then he was a lawyer. Like, he's been to law school. He was a lawyer, and this was his passion, and this is where he's ended up. Does not look like what you just said, right? Like, but if I built an apocalypse team and I wanted to be stranded, I wanted to survive a plane crash with anybody, it would be that dude. So
and eat good.
Yeah. And so that was the other thing. So that's where I was going with that. He walked out there with a steak and a little glass jar that he ended up telling was honey butter, and he had dough, and he had a pot, and he did have beans. So he put the beans in the pot, and he made some kind of beans. He went and he carved out a little hook and cordage, and he jammed it through his steak and just hung the steak over the fire to let it cook. I think even he just dropped the steak in the fire. He definitely sat there and he took that same honey butter and he wrapped it, or no, he had Gouda cheese, I remember. He wrapped the Gouda cheese in his dough, and he literally threw the dough and buried it in the coals. Dude pulls out a biscuit, a cheese-filled biscuit, scrapes off the coal, and then eats it. He was like, yeah, it's fine. It just tastes blackened. I'm just like, wow, man, that's crazy. But yeah, that guy cooks a meal that you have a hard time cooking in your kitchen with all the utensils on an open fire with next to nothing. So you know, you want to talk about practice and getting out there and becoming a survivalist. That's the way to do it.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me into the last point I was going to make is without getting up out of my chair and making a whole bunch of racket and going to grab it. It's hanging on a hook right over there on the other side of the room. But I have this little pack. It's a little bit bigger than a fanny pack. It's I guess, to be fair, if you picture like a fanny pack in your mind, it's probably the size of like 2 fanny packs. But I call that my Swift kit, SWFF, because your 4 priorities are survival, are shelter, water, fire, food. And it's this little kit that I made that's about the size of 2 fanny packs. And it has the like kind of absolute bare necessities that I would need to erect a shelter, to treat and purify and store some water. I have a collapsed rolled up water bladder in there, and then fire making stuff. And then we've talked before on other episodes of field stripping and MRE. So I have 2 field stripped MREs in there. So I actually have never put this to the test, and I actually would like to, but with what I have in this kit, I should be able to like survive like backcountry, off grid, outdoor boys survival for, I would say, up to, because I have 2 full meals there. MREs are very high calorie. I should be able to survive no problem, I think, for 2 to 3 days in an absolute off the grid backcountry survival situation. Now, when I go car camping, or when I just go regular camping, when I take my daughter on vacation and we go camping, I take that little kit with me so that I can practice building these little shelters. So if I'm ever in a survival situation, like I'm not figuring it out for the first time right then, I actually have brought my little Swift kit, I call it, and I do, and like it's actually like a fun campfire, or campground activity, is to like, yes, we have our nice Gucci tent over here with our nice sleeping bags and our sleeping pads and everything, but I also bring my little Swift kit so I can practice like an improvised shelter build. I don't have to sleep in it, but then I build it and erect it and climb under it, and it's almost like building a fort with my daughter. Yeah, test it out and be like, yeah, I could sleep here, but I'm not going to. Right. But anyway, but it's one thing to kind of to go over this stuff in your mind and Google search what a plow point shelter looks like and all that stuff. But just bring some basic stuff. Bring some 550 cord and some drywall screws and a Leatherman tool and a trash bag. And the next time you go like regular camping, see what you can build and and practice. But anyway, that's the last thing I had, was just practice this stuff. It's fun.
Awesome. Well, listen, guys, as I always end these shows, I thank you for spending some of your time with us. We could continue on here probably and break down every shelter that's out there, but the best thing for you to do is pick one that you think works best for you, put together a kit on how to do that, and get out there and practice. So until next time, you guys stay safe. Jamie?
That's all I got, man. Like I said, get out and practice. Figure out how to figure it out, and remember that it's easy to be hard and it's hard to be smart.
Awesome. All right, guys. Thanks. Until next time, ZP002 out.